Welcome to ShovelTalk, a podcast for economic developers. From your friends at the Golden Shovel Agency.
Hello, Shovelheads. Darren Varley welcoming you back to another episode of ShovelTalk. This episode, we have a special guest, Aaron Brossoit, CEO of Golden Shovel, has a great discussion with Eric Canada, author of Economic Development for the Team. So a couple thought leaders in our industry providing you a little thought leadership. Aaron, take it away.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. This is Aaron Brossoit with Golden Shovel Agency, and welcome to the ShovelTalk podcast. I am ecstatic today to have a special guest, and I get invited to do the podcast myself with Eric Canada. And I'm certain if you've been in the economic development field for any length of time, you've heard of Eric, you've been familiar with some of his work, and or know him personally. Welcome, Eric. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Aaron. It's fabulous to be with you.
So the first thing I just want to say about Eric Canada, he has touched all aspects of economic development, certainly since the dawn of me being in the industry. He has worked as a thought leader in the industry. He has done white papers on all sorts of topics affecting economic development. He's a published author, written multiple books, one of which we're going to be talking about today. He's been a teacher at the master's level, as well as workshops for the International Economic Development Council, and has had well over 12,000 students at this point that he's had a chance to influence. He's worked in a variety of different roles in economic development, including in the chambers of commerce and the like, and has also a tech entrepreneur, having started his own company with the synchronous software that many of you probably have used in your BR&E strategies. Wow, what a treat to have you here today. We're going to learn a little bit more about Eric, and we're going to talk about what he's been up to next and talk about his latest book.
Thank you. It's a delight to be with you and your audience. I have a lot of respect for what you've been able to do, Aaron, in your years in economic development. So good for you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Golden Shovel has been a good mentor and a good teacher through podcasts and your webinars. That's an important role that every economic developer should try to find a way to help pass it on. So congratulations to you and your team.
Agree. Thank you for that comment. And today's just going to be an expansion of that. So first of all, I want to start off just learning a little bit more about you and some of your inspiration behind writing this book. I mentioned Eric has written books before. He's written in the past the Economic Development Marketing for Results publication, and more recently, Economic Development for the Team. What is some of your background that makes you feel real situated to write books like these, particularly the Economic Development for the Team?
That's a great question, and I don't think anybody's really prepared to write a book. I never set out to write a book. My English teachers in high school and college would be dumbfounded by this fact, but it was as I worked both at the local level and at the state level with economic development, I was learning from a lot of people. And the information that I was gathering was all one-off. It was because I heard this speaker, or because I knew somebody, or because I read a white paper. And there was very limited information that was really out there on subjects like real marketing. And the time when we wrote the book, Marketing for Results, was the transition between what was called industrial marketing that came about in 1957 to the transition in the late 90s to business marketing and business to consumer marketing, and differentiating those two. And economic developers had historically been really focused on business to consumer marketing because all of our board members are consumers, where they sell to consumers. Very few of them are industrialists that sell to other industries. So there was a great misunderstanding. So that's what led me to write the book. The first part of that challenge was I was asked by AEDC at the time, predecessor to IEDC, to create a course on marketing. And in creating that course, I was looking for reference materials we could share with our students. And there were none. So here I was. The first course was coming up in February, and I'm in the October, November of the year, and I said, "Shit, there's nothing I can give these people, to take home to refer to, all the great stuff I'm going to talk about." So we set about in that 3-month period of time writing a document, which turned out to be about 125 pages, 3-ring binder, covering all the subjects that we were talking about. And that became the core of the book, Marketing for Results. We later expanded it, obviously, but we got a lot of feedback from people who read that, who took the course, and they said, this ought to be available to other people, as in a freestanding, as opposed to just with the course. And then because it was, 125 plus pages, AEDC got tired of printing it because it was a huge cost. So, one thing led to another, and we wrote the book. So it was kind of the domino effect. There was no, I set out to write a book a day. It just sort of happened. One thing led to another, and we ended up with a book. The first book. The second book was almost similar in nature, in that a client in Canada asked us to help train their team on economic development. What should they know as for somebody who's working with an economic developer, trying to support what they're doing, but they have a specific function? What should they know about what the economic developer is going through and dealing with in their everyday world, so they can better relate not only their services, but just as a person to that individual? So that training course created a bunch of PowerPoints and an 8-week series that ultimately converted into a book.
That makes a ton of sense.
So we never set out to write a book, Aaron. That wasn't ever my goal in life. But it was just part of that continuation, and part of the continuation of sharing. How do you help people like I was helped by a lot of my peers who taught me economic development? And by the work that I've done in the field, obviously, what I've learned there, how does that translate to help the next generation or somebody else?
Yeah, absolutely. That's it brings up a point, and head back in the day. I think it was PDI, the Professional Developers of Iowa. I was at a conference a while back, and I saw a speaker that spoke about passing the baton and generational the generational transfer of knowledge, and that economic developers particularly were doing a very bad job of it. And one of the issues is that the economic developers in general were older, and there wasn't a lot, they were staying in their positions longer, and there wasn't a lot of interest in the transition of knowledge because they were still holding their positions. This book, Economic Development for the Team, is the largest baton of its type that I've ever seen, that's really designed to be passed down to all of the new people coming into the economic development. And just huge kudos to that, because it's it's a selfless task to pass on knowledge, and but it's so valuable for everyone involved, and certainly speaks to your legacy and as an educator.
Well, our goal with the book, when we ultimately came down to saying should I spend the time to do this, was what you're referring to, passing the torch. How do we as economic developers train the next generation, or introduce other people to the right way to do economic development? Economic development is a hugely broad term that is totally undefined, except in each individual's mind. So unless there's a common language between the economic developer, his staff, and the board of directors, everybody's interpreting things differently. And how can you move forward or move forward quickly if we're always trying to catch up by making sure our language is correct, or overlapping. So that's really what the book was all about. It's not about helping the professional, although it should do that if it's well written, and it is, of course. What could I say? But it's intended to help the professional, and I was one of them. And I had a staff, and I had a board of directors, and I know what their questions were, and their exposure to economic development was very different than mine as the professional. So what we wanted to do was give the economic developer a tool to teach or train or at least orient his people, all those people that are helping us carry this community forward, help them have the same language so that when we talk about something, we have similar points of reference in our mind.
Makes a ton of sense. I noticed that you had. I know that there weren't economic development degrees back in the university when you started necessarily, but you do have a degree in psychology. And
I do.
I'm interested, like, how does that play into? I don't know how help better helping us understand people. Like, how does that play into this role and this what you've done in economic development?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because obviously it's one of those degrees that can be considered a throwaway. But in economic development, we're dealing with people and people's motivation and what motivates you, or what do you think about different things. So we're always trying to understand the individual because we don't do anything ourselves. We have to do it through a board of directors or a staff team in order to accomplish something. There are very few things I, as an individual economic developer, can accomplish. So in order for me to do that, I have to have, pardon me, some good understanding of who my people are and what motivates them and what their interests are. So I can utilize those interests to help them understand why working on my behalf as the economic developer is going to benefit them. So it's all psychology and it's all basic sales. I never set out to be in sales, but everything I have is something I've sold to somebody else because I always have, if I have an idea, if I have a strategy, if I have a process, if I have a program, if I have a need, I have to convince other people that that is a valued position and that yes, that is good to support that. So it's all boils down to people and dealing with people, and that is what psychology is about.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. That makes sense to me. You've also been a longtime educator, as I mentioned in the beginning. Yep. So you were taught the master's degree in economic development for University of Southern Mississippi. You've done all of these workshops with IEDC, and as you explained, your books came right out of requests for you to provide training materials and the like. What have you learned from working in those roles, and do you still feel like educator today?
Absolutely. I'm still with the New Mexico Basic Economic Development course, and I've taught in Ohio and Iowa, in Georgia, and various other locations in the basic courses over the years. And again, that's reinvesting in the people who are coming up and creating that opportunity to hear what they're thinking about, incorporate that in my thinking, and then being able to share both what I think and they're worried about or thinking about back with others. So it's a process that's a give and take. It's not all me blurting out information and passing it down. It's what I'm learning from them and their questions. When you get in front of an audience, they ask questions, and there's no rhyme or reason as to where a question comes from or whether it's related to anything. But it's important to that person. So you have to try to understand, okay, well, why this question, or what are they trying to get at, and then come back at them with something that may be useful if you have something, or tell them, I don't have a clue, in that particular area. That's not area I work in. So it's from these students, what I get is the kind of information that ends up in a book like this. We talked before we started about the glossary. All the terminology that we as economic developers have is out there, but it's not organized. The book has a glossary of terms so that I can look it up if I am that local economic developer. And a lot of terms and terminology questions come out of interacting with students. But it's not, I didn't start that. A guy by the name of Greg Last, he's probably out of the retention, probably retired by now, but he had originally done a glossary that he was making available, and he gave me permission to expand it and convert it to support the book. So Greg's work is me passing something that I got from a mentor on to others.
Oh, yeah, that's fantastic. I wanted to put special attention to the glossary. I found it to be very interesting, even being somebody that's been in the field for 20 years now, because it not only covers some of the technical terms that come up often in economic development, also covers some of the more less, I guess, more industry specific terms like economic gardening or some of these other areas, but then also hits on all of the various acronyms and associations that are out there that are players for economic development. So it wasn't just technical terms, but really the ecosystem of economic development. And I think, especially if you are new to the field, it can take a long time to make sense out of the alphabet soup of acronyms in this industry. And you did a nice job of clarifying that.
Yeah, where do you go if you're a new professional to get that? Do you Google it? And if you Google it, what response do you get? And is it relevant to economic development, which is where your question came from? We tried to build a fairly comprehensive list of things that a staff member is going to run into these questions and may not be able to ask you. So they can refer to the back of the book, look it up, and bang, they're on their way. They have at least a starting point.
Very nice resource. I wanted to ask you just a little bit about your roles in the chambers. You both worked for the Illinois State Chamber as the Director of Economic Development, but also a couple local chambers before that. So you've got a really wide perspective on the different levels of economic development in that sense. Could share some of the lessons you learned from those roles?
Well, I was doing what I teach now when I was working local economic development. Both roles, both with Daviess County in southern Indiana and Lake County when I was moved to northern Illinois. In both those roles, business retention was a key part of it. So my interest in business retention stems from those interactions with those manufacturers and companies in my communities. So obviously, I can relate to an economic developer because I've done that. I've done business attraction. I've helped build an industrial park. I've done a lot of the things that we do in economic development, either as the actual player or as a coach. When I was with the Illinois State Chamber, I moved from a doing it role to more of a coaching role, where I was doing support for the local economic developers throughout Illinois, the local chambers, the EDCs, and other people who were involved in it, and then working more on the policy issues. So again, I got a different perspective when you're trying to figure out writing incentive legislation. That's a very different perspective than trying to apply it when you're at the local level. So my background gives me the broadest possible exposure to economic development, probably. And then as a consultant, we were specializing in either strategic planning or in business retention or in the marketing side of economic development. So we were very engaged in those specific program components of economic development and going deeper and deeper. And one of the books that I read years and years and years ago, uh, I forget the name, but it'll come to me in a minute. But it was about an expert. And an expert is the person who keeps digging the hole deeper. And that expert has so much invested in that hole that they can't look around at what other opportunities there are. And one of the things I've always tried to do with my career is keep a broader perspective, dig the hole, and pass that stuff on through the white papers and the books that we've written or through the educational courses, but keep looking where I might be able to have a bigger impact, or I might be able to learn something new that may benefit me and or others in economic development. So Edward de Bono was the guy's name who wrote the book, and the book was Lateral Thinking, I believe. And it's a really important philosophy to keep in mind. You can't keep digging the same hole, or you dig yourself into oblivion, basically. You have to be willing. And in my career, I've had 4 different careers, basically all in economic development, but it's been a logical move from one to another. But it's all because of lateral thinking and not and be the ultimate expert in business retention. I did that for a long time and had good results and passed on a lot of that information and then moved on, as we're talking about now. So.
Right. Yeah, no kidding. Well, 4 different careers. That's interesting. And speaking of one of those careers, you were the founder of Blaine Canada and had run for 22 years. That's when I had met you about 15, 16 years ago now. And you were both, what I thought was interesting about Blaine Canada is part consultancy, but you're also very much a tech entrepreneur. You created some really important softwares that had a big influence on the industry. And the software I'm thinking of specifically, and I know there were multiple, is the Synchronist software that was designed. We had many clients using Synchronist software, and it was for gathering business retention and expansion data from the companies that was help organize that so they can make important decisions for the community. What was some of your motivation for creating those technologies? And 22 years, if you could just wrap that up in a nutshell of what that experience was.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a sentence or two. Well, the motivation was back when I was in Illinois, one of the things we worked on across the state was business retention, and everybody always had their own program. And when I was taught business retention, they basically tell you to get interview tools from half a dozen of your colleagues out there, and then pick and choose the questions you want to use, and then go out in the field and ask those questions. That's a valid process, and it'll get you there. You'll gain information in that. You'll obviously begin to form relationships, so there's value there. But what that doesn't give me is anything that is objective in nature. It's totally a subjective process. So there's nothing I can compare from 2 different communities who have interviewed, 24 manufacturing companies. So Synchronist was challenging the assumption that the way we had done it was the way we should be doing it. And it was trying to bring discipline to a process that would also create objective comparability. One of the perspectives we used when we were designing Synchronist was that of a stockbroker. And a stockbroker looks at a lot of information and then has to make a decision. Is it a buy or sell? And that's what we wanted to be able to do with the information we were collecting from Synchronist. We wanted to know 4 things. Was this company a growth company? Were they growing? What was their value to the community as a business? What was their risk of leaving? Is there a potential this company could not be here or could be on its way out? And then finally, is there satisfaction? Are they satisfied? That's all stuff that I need to manage my portfolio of companies. Because if you think about it, we are responsible for managing a portfolio of companies. We didn't choose the portfolio, they just happen to be in our communities. We're now responsible for them, but none of us have an abundance of time that we can lavishly support everybody. So, how do we choose where we're going to put our time and our resources? So, COVID comes around, and economic developers, and we put together a group of 300 people, 325 economic developers around the country who were getting together to talk about what do we do about business retention in a COVID environment where we're obviously not interacting with them face to face. We're interacting through a video screen. And part of that led to a part of that problem was there was no way for the organizations that were part of that team or any other economic developer to go to their business retention data and utilize that to give grants to companies that were the most important to the community. So a lot of money was being passed out, a lot of technical support was being organized, but we really didn't have a focus for where it went. So it went to the first person to ask. If you know a company's value, if you know a company's growth potential, I can direct those resources to the companies that are most important to my community. So that's, the theory that was behind it. That was part of the evolution. We also used, as part of the strategy of coming up with it, was a military strategy, a director of a field event in the military, a battle basically, and how that, a lot of information coming at you quickly, how you condense that into something that's meaningful quickly, and you do this with 30 questions. You don't have an unlimited amount of time. So it was a fascinating process. It lasted, as you said, for 22 years. It just became unsustainable to be an independent or a single focused tool in an environment where every economic developer and chamber wanted something to manage their events, their contacts, their finances, their memberships, and all those other pieces that are part of that technology component of economic development. Yep. So, we ultimately had to shut it down, but it was a fabulous experiment, and we proved, and we had national data for the first time ever in business retention, statewide data in some communities. So it was fascinating exercise.
Yeah, and it's no doubt influenced an entire, the next generation.
Yeah, there was a generation of economic developers who learned a different theory of business retention for sure.
Yeah, you bet. And then I suppose this is your fourth career, but now you're leading a nonprofit because why not? After the chambers and being a teacher, and then running a company for 20 some years, why not start a nonprofit? Why don't you tell me a little bit about Synchronous Lab and what you're working on?
Yeah, the reality is there are challenges that only can be addressed if you have certain level of control. I've been working with colleague Derek Sherman for the last 20 years in cluster work, working with clusters of businesses, basically industries, and to stand those clusters up so that they could become more interconnected, as well as more prominent and more dominant in their market area. We've done 3 of them successfully, and from those exercises, we have learned that control is critical, and that the manufacturer or the industry type that you're dealing with has to be making the budget decisions. And in our past, we had always worked through a local economic development group or a regional economic development group, and you run into things like jurisdictional boundaries. If you're a 5-county economic development group putting together a cluster like we did in Peoria, Illinois, you pretty soon run out of companies in that industry. And in order to keep growing it, you have to step beyond that 5-county boundary, or you have to start something different, a different industry.
Mm-hmm.
And that physical barrier of jurisdictions has been a burden. So we wanted to break that jurisdictional thing down. And the only way to do that was to create basically a program where we define what the region is. And we're not dependent on one political jurisdiction for financial support. So the nonprofit gives us the ability to stack the deck in terms of who's on the board of directors, and it allows us to acquire money and focus that money on a industry cluster. Our first one is durable goods and components, basically, in a Midwestern area of Chicago, Milwaukee, Rockford, basically, triangular area that covers 12 counties in 2 states. So it's a solution. We're creating a solution to a problem that has nagged at us for 20 years. And in order for us to be successful, we had to break that. And that barrier was basically forming this nonprofit. And if we do it right, this nonprofit will contribute to the future of economic development, because it will carry on long after I'm gone. There will be other people that we can train to do the piece that Eric would do, or the piece that Derek would do. And we can take it to other jurisdictions as well and do work in Northwest Florida or Northeast Florida, or down in the Houston area where we've been invited to have discussions with them. So it allows us to deal with it on a broader scale, which is essential for being successful in a cluster development strategy.
Wow, that is a big shift in perspective. I suppose by nature,
it's business, but you break it down, it's business retention. We're still trying to retain the companies that are here. We're trying to help those companies grow, and we're trying to bring new companies into this market who are part of that cluster. So it's economic development. It's classic.
Oh, absolutely. And I can see why it might have quite a bit more success. I mean, instead of saying, hey, what clusters do I have in my 4-county region? You're saying what cluster exists or what clusters does my county touch versus what is it in control of, when frankly, the clusters are in control of themselves, I suppose. And ultimately, you get to redefine that. I bet there's some challenging topics. Certainly economic development dollars that go to local governments are expected to be spent within those boundaries.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so,
and a lot of, this obviously is going to be dependent upon federal funding to get the wheels going, to get things started. So we're working with the EDA, we're working with the SBA, we're working with foundations to generate that initial cash flow that we can build this. But ultimately, what that does is it allows, as you said, individual counties to participate, because most economic developers don't have anything they're really doing for their manufacturing base. They don't have a way to plug them into something. They may have a manufacturers council. They get together and they talk about issues periodically, but there's no real service they could provide them. This provides the way for that rural county or that suburban county who doesn't have enough density to be a cluster of their own to participate and get the value out of being in a larger cluster.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's exciting. And it looks
that's
like
a whole separate topic. Yeah,
you are,
and you're right. That's another career.
Once again, treading new territory in the industry. So that's exciting stuff. We'll look forward to see where that all goes.
Absolutely. We'll be happy to take you along, Aaron.
Fair enough. Yes, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about this book, Economic Development for the Team. I mentioned earlier, it's like this is a great book for economic developers as a whole, including professionals, I believe, but especially those new to the field. I see professionals being able to use it as training for the younger generations, training their boards to look at it from the same perspective as you mentioned earlier. But for new people and passing that baton down, this is the first of its type. We haven't seen a book of this nature before. What was your inspiration for this, for writing it out in the first place?
Yeah, well, ultimately it came from a client assignment. That was the first step. But after that, it became an understanding that there is a gap between me, the professional, and what I know and what I can learn, and my team. If I am a really fortunate and have a nice budget, I can send one probably other person, maybe two, to Iowa development, professional developers of Iowa meeting, or an Illinois meeting, or Montana, or whatever state you happen to be in, which
Mm-hmm.
is where a lot of the initial learning takes place. You know, but that really doesn't happen, and that's not very many people. So how are you going to help that individual that you depend on to do certain things to be able to understand what you're trying to help them do? And that's what this book was about. And that's why it was created and approached more as a training tool than a book for the individual professional. There aren't many topics in here that the professional won't have heard about or be aware of, but we've packaged it in a way to have it so that you could have a read this chapter, and then next month or next week we talk about it. So you could have a paced uh, approach to discussing this again with your board of directors or your team or some combination of both those things. So that's really why it's designed the way it is and why it focuses on the subjects that it focuses on.
Oh, fantastic. And I noticed that a certain, I can tell that you were a teacher in the past. It's really well organized. It's organized to learn in a certain way. The main sections of this book, it opens up with environment and goes into organizational structure, then technology, then a whole variety of different types of programs that economic developers should be aware of and take advantage of it, and the product of economic development. Um, I'm just curious, why did you choose to lead with environment, and for the people that haven't read the book, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's the context. Why do we do economic development? We do economic development because of things that are happening in the economy around us or to our community. And if we don't understand that and where money comes from that comes into our community, how are we ever going to understand economic development? So the very first principle in the book is, the difference between retail, regional retail, and industrial and agricultural and mining, and the different kinds of money flows that are created by those industries. And what can you build a community on? If you don't understand that basic environmental component, you're never going to have an impact on your future community. Yeah, because you just can't. You're going to operate within the context of programs. We'll do this program, we'll try that, and you're never really going to be able to create momentum for the community in a very positive way. And you'll never be able to do a transitional shift, a major transitional shift, if you don't understand the money flows that create the value, the dollars that you need to do that. So that's why we start with environment. And it's not environment in the eco sense. It's not, just the context of, climate and things like that and the climate changing. It's really the economic environment that we're talking about.
Excellent opening. One of the things in the technology section, you had talked about the economic developers technology triad. I hadn't heard that term before. Could you explain for the listeners a little bit, what is the technology triad?
Yeah, it's a self-invention. Authors do this all the time. You have to create ways to describe or help people think about, components, things that have parts that we talk about in a general term. We talk about technology-led economic development. What does that mean? Well, is that technology-driven strategy? Is that technology-driven processes? Or is that technology-driven operations? So we wanted to break it down into its components. So processes, for example, is all the work that's been done. For example, Synchronist was part of that. It was automating a process that made you more effective at completing that process and gave you more as a result of it. Site selection is a huge area for process improvement. The mapping, the searching, the proposal writing, all the stuff that they've done, Lois and others with organizing that information and giving you as the economic developer control over a visible component that the manufacturer, can easily find, search, and figure out, that's a process. So is that what we mean by technology-driven economic development? Or do we mean it's attracting, medical research facilities and R&D? Or is it commercialization of R&D coming out of the university, like in Wisconsin at Madison University of Wisconsin in Madison? So that's another component of possibly technology-driven economic development. But then there's just the operational stuff. We have a lot of technology like yours that is kind of operational because it helps us organize. The website helps us organize our story and make it available to other people. So our file cabinet's not hidden behind us where somebody has to come through the front door to get to it. So you've created that tool to help support the operation. Is that less technology-driven economic development or more, or is it not? So we wanted to bring all these processes to light so that I begin to think about them individually, as opposed to, well, it's just technology-led economic development, which is the way IEDC talks about it. It's more than that. So Tech Triad is a way to think about those components as part of a larger system.
Yeah, fantastic. That definitely rings clear and rings true with what we're doing at Golden Shovel.
Yeah.
There's one thing to make technology, like the development of like our software itself, but just as much as the technology applied to the processes that speed those up, that make them faster, make them more reliable, and be able to deliver more value for the same amount of time. I see it's not just building the technology, it's utilizing the technology to influence the strategy. Wonderful.
And when all three of those pieces work together, you have a much more effective organization. Clearly.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. The book itself certainly has as you noted, an opportunity for seasoned professionals to be able to utilize it to help educate the younger generations in the industry. Is there some kind of corresponding piece, like are there workshops that follow along this, or training that corresponds with the book?
Great question. No, we've never put together a workshop. It wasn't intended, again, for the economic developer, I guess, but more for the team. So what we did put together, and what goes out with every book that we sell, is a training syllabus, basically. It's broken down into 8 different parts. Each one of those is a chapter in the book. And one time, again, you can assign the staff to read the book or the chapter on product. So they read that, and then you come together as a team and have a discussion about your product, the product that your community brings to the table, and how that's perceived and things like that. And it doesn't mean you, the economic developer, have to agree with what I've got in the book. You can absolutely disagree, but it creates the environment in which you can have that conversation. Otherwise, we talk about product because we're talking about business attraction, and our staff isn't sure what that means, and our board has no clue what that means. They think it's the infrastructure or the industrial park. They see that as the product. They don't see the fact that the product also includes Main Street, the liveliness of the community, and the workforce that is essential to that company and every future company. So, we wanted to break it down. We wanted to make it something that I could work through as a professional, lead my group through, and have substantive discussions about these topics so that we could be pulling in the same direction and we could accelerate. Because if I have to stop every time I want to do something and educate, then I have slowed my process down considerably. If everything I want to sell to the board of directors has to include an education, then again, I've slowed down the decision-making process of my board and slowed me down to getting to the end goal, which is actually implementing whatever it is I'm trying to sell them. So this is, again, a tool to pull people together to have meaningful discussions within the community that can lead to a tighter coordination of the economic development team and strategy.
Perfect. Well, it comes highly recommended by Golden Shovel. How can economic developers get a copy of this?
They can reach out to us through our website, blainecanada.com. We used to have it on Amazon. We stopped doing that because Amazon has found a way to take most of the revenue out of that process, for a small publisher. So we basically sell it directly. So they can reach out to me, 630-936-8078, or again, through our website or my email address, ecanada@blainecanada.com. And we'd be happy to get you a copy in the training syllabus, or a dozen copies, one for every one of your board members.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're discounted, of course, if you're buying more copies. So, yeah.
Well, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for sharing about your book. Once again, highly recommended. Just kind of at the end here, before we get into Golden Shovel's shovel toss game, where we toss you a bunch of questions. Looking forward, what do you see changing and some of the challenges for economic developers today? You've seen the industry shift dramatically over so many years. Yeah. What do you see coming up?
And that's always a tough question to answer. But obviously, I wouldn't be moving in the direction of clusters if I didn't have faith in thinking that they were really the biggest opportunity for an economic developer. It's not a local opportunity again, it's a regional one. And you have to think regionally to do that. So it's a different play. But I think investing in the clusters that are contiguous to or in our communities and around them is absolutely essential. The other part, everybody knows that it's a workforce game now. Everybody knows that it's an infrastructure game. We've sold out all the infrastructure that we used to have. We've sold out the workforce that we used to have. So now it's a catch-up game in those two areas. So economic development has changed from a marketing game to a product development game. For some communities, it's always been that, because if you're in a rural community, you always had struggles with workforce and infrastructure. But for the majority of communities, it's headed back that way, where those become the drivers, and the attraction side becomes less valuable and less important. Still critical, but the existing business community and building around that is where you're going to see more success, and that's again why I'm pursuing the cluster strategy.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing.
The last thing I would add to that, Aaron, is the subject we started talking about, and that's passing the baton. We have to figure out as a profession how we're going to get new people involved and how we're going to educate those people and the people around them to do economic development effectively. And we've not been good at that as a profession. We do it one-on-one. Obviously I can do the IEDC courses, the basic courses. I can do the Oklahoma course and do it as a professional and get certified. I can get my certification as an individual. But what I know doesn't help me if my team isn't there and if I'm not thinking about my staff person as a potential future economic developer, either in the community or somewhere else in the state.
Yep.
So we have to invest in our own.
Yep. It's well, thank you just for sharing all of this. So there's a lot of information, and it's now time to play the shovel toss game. So I'm going to ask you 10 questions. Your job is just to answer them as quickly as possible. And I believe this is a consistent kind of game show twist at the end of all of the Golden Shovel podcasts. So,
fantastic.
Are you ready?
I am ready. Set the timer. Let's go for it.
Ready, set, go. What was your first car?
My first car was a 1950 Chevy Business Coupe. 3-speed, 6-cylinder. Lots of fun.
Nice. What's your favorite dessert?
That would have to be carrot cake.
All right. If you were to be a superhero, what would you be?
I'd be the business retention superhero. I'd be able to pull clusters together instantly and boom, bang them out the door. Yeah. And the U.S. would be the absolute world center of every industry.
I hope that happens. Favorite vacation destination?
The islands in the Caribbean, Turks and Caicos has always been a favorite.
Nice. What book are you reading now?
The book I'm reading now is actually for a friend. I'm editing a book on business retention. Not business retention, but strategic planning, economic engineering.
What's at the top of your bucket list?
I've just bought a 1954 Ford truck, and getting that on the road is my goal.
Okay. What is your go-to song?
Any of the Elton Johns. I'm a big Elton John fan, but I just came back from the Pink concert. She does a great show. I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in loud music and theatrics.
Nice. Is there something you can't live without?
My bicycle and a gym. Yeah, I have physical exercise.
All right. What do you wish you would have known when you started your career?
I've stumbled through it. It's been fairly effective. I said it's been 4 different careers. So flexibility is one. Entrepreneurship is the key to all of my career. You have to think like an entrepreneur.
And what would you like to be remembered for?
Just contributing to economic development, being part of a great industry and helping others be more effective in that industry.
All right, we'll stop. You did our entire quiz in 2 minutes and 22 seconds. So
not a record time.
I have to say that is not fast, but you get the benefit of having 4 careers to reflect on and excellent answers to all of the questions.
Yeah, you didn't ask me to be fast. I was being more thorough than fast. I could have been faster, but it would have been less interesting.
It's all right. I consider you having won it. Well, once again, thank you for your time. Thanks for joining the Shovel Talk of the Golden Shovel Agency's podcast. And everybody go check out blainecanada.com to get a copy of economic development for the team. And I look forward to having you on again sometime soon.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It's been a delight, and thank you for what you and Golden Shovel are doing for the profession. Best wishes. Talk later.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Eric and Aaron. You know what, folks? I'm going to end this one quickly. We've got count them, three podcasts ready for editing, so I got to get to work. So obviously, I will be seeing you very soon on another episode of Shovel Talk.